The bullet struck the fuel drum at exactly the moment Sergeant Hale said it couldn't be done. That was the thing about Sergeant First Class Mara Voss. She didn't argue. She didn't explain herself. She just did the thing people said was impossible. And she did it so quietly that half the time nobody even noticed until the smoke cleared. But on that ridge in the Korengal, everybody noticed. It started 3 weeks before the shot. Mara had transferred into the 75th Ranger Regiment's support element as a forward observer attached to Bravo Company. And from the moment she walked into the teak, with her rifle case and her notebook and her way of saying almost nothing, the men in that room had already made up their minds about her. Hale had been the most vocal. He was a 15-year veteran, broad-shouldered and square-jawed in the way that made civilians think of recruitment posters. And he had opinions the way some men have furniture, heavy, everywhere, impossible to move around. He'd looked at Mara's rifle, a heavily modified bolt action she'd built herself over 2 years, and he'd said, in front of everyone, "That's a deer hunter's gun." Mara had looked at him, just looked. Then she'd set the case down, opened her notebook, and asked the nearest intelligence officer about the topographical breakdown of the valley they were deploying into. That was how she responded to most things, by ignoring them and getting back to work. The problem was, in Bravo Company, getting back to work wasn't always enough. Captain Devereaux ran a tight unit. He was fair, in the way that commanding officers who'd never had their competence questioned tend to be fair, meaning he applied rules evenly, without ever examining whether the rules themselves were designed for people like him. He'd reviewed Mara's file. Her marksmanship scores were exceptional. Her field assessments were thorough. Her recommendations in the 3 previous deployments she'd completed had saved lives. None of that had translated into trust, because trust in Bravo Company was built in the field, and Mara hadn't been in their field yet. Hale made sure everyone remembered that. "Observe and report," he'd said at the first pre-mission briefing, nodding toward Mara like she was a piece of equipment. "That's the role. We're not running an experiment out there." Mara had written something in her notebook. Nobody could see what. The mission itself seemed straightforward, the way missions always seem straightforward until they aren't. A suspected insurgent command post in the upper Korengal had been identified through SIGINT. Bravo Company was to conduct a reconnaissance in force, confirm the intelligence, and if the situation warranted, call in air support. Mara's role was to establish an overwatch position on the eastern ridge and provide targeting data. She'd studied the terrain for 6 days before they deployed. She'd requested imagery from 3 different angles, cross-referenced it with historical weather data for the valley, and made a series of calculations about wind behavior that she'd written in the margins of her notebook in a hand so small that even she sometimes needed a magnifying glass to read it back. "You actually going to shoot anything from up there?" asked Corporal Stein on the morning they moved out. He was 22 and trying to grow a beard that wasn't quite working, and he asked it the way young soldiers sometimes ask questions, not to be cruel, just genuinely uncertain about where the pieces fit. "If I have to," Mara said. "Hale says the ridge is 1,600 meters from the objective, closer to 1,750. Stein blinked. "Yes," Mara said. "It is." She said it without drama. That was the thing people kept misreading about her. They heard flat and thought cold, heard quiet and thought uncertain. What they were actually hearing was a person who had already done the calculation, already accounted for the variables, and had nothing left to prove to herself about the outcome. The uncertainty she performed for no one. The climb to the ridge took 4 hours. Mara went with a 2-man team, Corporal Fenway and Private Aldrin Bosch, though everyone called him Dutch, and they moved without speaking for most of it, which suited Mara fine. She liked the silence of elevation. She liked the way the valley opened up below you as you climbed, the way you could begin to understand distance as something physical rather than something abstract. From the ridge, the objective was laid out like a diagram. She could see the compound walls, the vehicle track running east to west, the 2 guard positions that were supposed to be there, according to the intelligence wasn't, and a 3rd one that wasn't. She noted it in her logbook, radioed it down to Devereaux. There was a pause on the other end. Then Hale's voice, "You sure about that 3rd position?" "Positive." Another pause. "Intel doesn't show it." "Intel is 12 days old," Mara said. "The position is there. Northwest corner, partial concealment behind what looks like a generator housing. 2 personnel, rotating on what I'm estimating as a 90-minute cycle based on the pattern I've observed since we established Overwatch." Silence. Devereaux's voice replaced Hale's. How long have you been on that ridge, Voss? 2 hours and 14 minutes, sir. And you've tracked a 90-minute rotation cycle? 1.5 cycles, sir. Enough to establish the pattern. There was something in his voice that might have been recalibration, or it might have been doubt wearing a pole-eater face. Noted. We'll adjust. They didn't adjust enough. The breach happened at 0342, and for the first 4 minutes, it went exactly the way it was supposed to go. Devereaux's team entered from the south. The 2 guard positions identified in the original intel were neutralized cleanly. The compound looked quiet, then the northwest corner erupted. The 3rd guard position, the one Mara had reported, had been reinforced. What had been 2 personnel was now 4, and they had a crew-served weapon that the 12-day-old intelligence had not accounted for. And when it opened up, it pinned Devereaux's lead element in a kill zone that had clearly been constructed with the specific purpose of making extraction difficult. From the ridge, Mara watched it happen in the way that forward observers sometimes have to watch things happen, with terrible clarity and the acute awareness that the difference between life and death was currently moving through her calculations. The crew-served weapon was behind a reinforced position. There was partial cover. A direct shot was not possible from the south or west, which was why Devereaux's team couldn't suppress it. From the east, from her angle, from 1,750 meters away, in a valley where the night wind came down from the peaks in eddies that shifted every 40 seconds, there was a shot. It wasn't an easy shot. It was, in fact, the kind of shot that experienced snipers sometimes describe as the edge of the possible. Not impossible, but existing in the narrow margin where technique and physics and patience and luck overlapped in a way that couldn't be engineered, only attempted. She keyed her radio. I have a firing solution on the crew-served position. Hale's voice came back instantly. Negative. 1750 is outside your effective range. My effective range? Or the range listed in the manual? A beat of silence that felt longer than it was. Stand by, Devereaux said. Down in the compound, she could see Devereaux's lead element moving, trying to find cover that didn't exist. She could see Sergeant Pena dragging someone. She thought it was Stein, from the build toward a low wall that would buy them maybe 30 seconds before the crew-served weapon walked rounds across it. I don't have time for standby, Mara said. It was the flattest she'd ever sounded on a radio, which was saying something. I have a firing solution. I am requesting authorization. Hale's voice again, the wind variance in that valley, Will? I've been tracking the wind variance in this valley for 2 hours and 14 minutes, Mara said. I have logged 47 wind readings. I know the pattern. I know the cycle. I know where it's going to be in the next 8 seconds, and in that window, I have a shot. The silence on the radio lasted 3 seconds. 3 seconds is a long time when someone is in a kill zone. Take it, Devereaux said. Mara had already been in position for the last 45 seconds. She'd been waiting for the authorization while simultaneously refusing to need it, settling into the shot, slowing her breathing, reading the air the way her grandfather had taught her to read still water, looking for the surface tension that told you where the current was moving underneath. She squeezed the trigger at the precise moment she'd calculated. The round traveled 1,753 meters in just under 2 seconds. The crew-served weapon went silent. For a moment, nothing moved. Then Devereaux's voice on the radio, very quiet. Compound is clear. Move to objective. On the ridge, Mara worked the bolt, cleared the chamber, and wrote the time in her logbook. She didn't think about the shot the way people imagine snipers thinking about shots, with some dramatic internal reckoning. She thought about whether the wind pattern would hold for the extraction phase. It wouldn't, she decided. It would shift in the next 20 minutes. She radioed that information down as well. Nobody on the radio said anything in response for a moment. Then Dutch, who was lying 6 feet to her left and had been watching through his spotting scope, said quietly, "That was something." Mara capped her optic. "Write down the wind reading. I want to compare it against what I logged at the same time yesterday." Dutch looked at her for a moment. Then he wrote down the wind reading. The debrief happened at Fob Salerno 2 days later, in a room with fluorescent lights and a coffee maker that had been producing substandard results for what appeared to be several years. Mara had written her after-action report on the helicopter ride back. It was 14 pages long and included a section on the inadequacy of 12-day-old intelligence in dynamic tactical environments, which she'd kept professionally worded, but which said, between every line, that someone had made a decision to move on outdated information and people had nearly died for it. Hale arrived at the debrief before she did. He was already in his seat when she walked in, and he looked at her with the expression of a man who was recalibrating something he didn't want to admit needed recalibrating. He didn't say anything right away. Devereaux opened the debrief with his after-action summary, which was precise and honest in the way that good officers manage after an operation that nearly went badly. He walked through the timeline. He noted the intelligence gap. He noted the crew serve position. He noted the fire support. He said, the shot that neutralized the crew-served weapon was taken from the eastern ridge at a range of approximately 1,750 meters under variable wind conditions at night. He paused. It saved the lives of at minimum 4 personnel who were in a kill zone with no viable route of extraction. Another pause. Sergeant First Class Mara Voss took that shot. The room was quiet. Mara didn't look at Hale. She was reading her own after-action report again, checking for a section she wanted to reference in the discussion. What happened next was the thing that people who weren't in the room would later get wrong when they heard the story. They assumed Hale had made some dramatic acknowledgement, a speech, an apology, something cinematic. What actually happened was that Hale reached across the table, picked up the copy of Mara's after-action report that had been placed in front of him, and started reading it. Not skimming, reading. Tracing paragraphs with his finger the way people do when they're taking something seriously. He read for a while. The room waited. Then he said, without looking up, the section on intelligence currency. The 12-day threshold you're proposing? Yes, Mara said. You'd implement that regiment-wide? I'd implement it as a planning standard, not a hard limit. The hard limit creates rigidity. A planning standard creates accountability. You're required to document why you're using intelligence beyond the threshold and what you've done to validate it against current indicators. Hale looked up from the report. He looked at her for a moment with that same recalibrating expression. I think that's right, he said. It wasn't an apology. But it was, for Hale, something that cost him more than an apology would have. It was a concession that her analysis was correct, given in a room full of people who would remember it. Mara nodded and wrote something in her notebook. Devereaux moved on to the next section of the debrief. Outside the window, the fob was running through its morning routine, and somewhere a generator was cycling down. 3 weeks later, Mara received orders transferring her to a new assignment. She spent her last night at Salerno, sitting outside the TOC with her logbook, reviewing the wind data from the Korengal operation the way some people review photographs, not to relive the event, but to understand something about it that she hadn't fully understood at the time. Dutch found her there around midnight and sat down without being invited, which was how she knew he'd spent enough time around her to understand that permission was more for him than for her. What are you doing? He asked. Looking for the error margin, she said. In the shot? In the calculation that preceded the shot. The wind shifted earlier than I predicted. 6 seconds earlier. I want to know if I missed something or if it was within acceptable variance. Dutch was quiet for a moment. You hit the target. I know. At 1750-53, she corrected automatically. Right. He looked out at the fob. Does it matter if the wind shifted early, but you still hit it? Mara thought about that. She thought about it the way she thought about most things. Not quickly, not publicly, but with the kind of methodical patience that other people sometimes mistook for indifference. It matters, she said finally, because the next time the conditions are similar, I need to know whether my prediction model is accurate or whether I got lucky. If it's accurate, I can rely on it. If I got lucky, I need to know that too, so I don't treat luck like a system. Dutch was quiet for a long moment. That's, he said, a very Voss answer. She wrote something in the logbook. Hale asked about you, Dutch said. This afternoon? Asked where you were being transferred. Mara didn't respond. He also asked, this is the part I thought you'd want to know. He asked if you'd written anything about the intelligence currency protocol. The 12-day threshold thing from your AAR. He wanted to know if there was a longer paper. Mara flipped back 3 pages in her logbook. She'd been developing it since the debrief. It was currently 11 pages and growing. There will be, she said. Dutch nodded. He sat with her for a while longer, not talking, which was one of the things she'd come to appreciate about him. He understood that silence was its own kind of communication, that sometimes the most respectful thing you could do for a person was simply to stay in the same space without demanding that they fill it. Eventually, he said goodnight and went inside. Mara stayed with her logbook until the wind off the mountains picked up around 0200, carrying the particular cold that she'd learned to associate with elevation change, the air dropping from the peaks like something slowly let go. She noted the time, she noted the direction, she noted the temperature differential against her earlier readings and found that it was consistent with the pattern she'd been tracking for the past 2 weeks. She wrote, error margin within acceptable variance. Prediction model intact. Then she closed the logbook. The thing about Mara Voss, the thing that people who'd served with her tried to explain later to people who hadn't, was that she was not trying to prove anything to anyone. That was what made her unusual. Most people who were underestimated either collapsed under the weight of it or burned with the need to correct it. Mara operated in a third register, one that most people never found, which was to simply proceed as if the estimation were irrelevant. Not because she didn't notice. She noticed everything. She noticed the way Hale had said deer hunter's gun, with the particular emphasis of a man who'd already made a decision. She noticed the way the briefing room had gone quiet when she'd first walked in, the kind of quiet that wasn't about respect. She noticed every time the precise moment when someone recalibrated their expectations downward, and the different, later moment when they had to revise that recalibration. She noticed all of it. She simply declined to let it govern her. That was the skill nobody had trained her in. Her marksmanship, her wind reading, her intelligence analysis, her fieldcraft, those had been built through years of practice and study and failure and correction. But this other thing, this capacity to receive doubt without metabolizing it, to let it pass through her the way wind passes through wire. She wasn't entirely sure where that had come from. Her grandfather, maybe? He'd been a man who'd spent 50 years being told that his opinions on things didn't count, on account of reasons that had nothing to do with whether his opinions were correct, and he developed a method for living inside that condition without being defined by it. He hadn't called it anything, he'd just done it. And watching him do it, Mara had learned something she couldn't have articulated at the time but understood now, standing at the edge of a fob in the dark with wind data in a logbook, that the people whose approval you need are almost never the people whose approval you have, and the work of a life is to care correctly about the difference. She picked up the logbook and walked back inside. Her replacement was arriving in 4 days. She'd already written a 12-page briefing document on the valley terrain, the wind patterns, the guard rotation schedules she'd developed, and the intelligence currency protocol she was continuing to refine. She would leave it on the desk in the overwatch position with the orientation notes. She didn't know who would read it or whether they would take it seriously. She wrote it anyway. The commendation came 6 weeks after she'd left Salerno, forwarded to her new assignment in a plain envelope with Devereaux's signature on the bottom. It described the engagement in careful official language, the range, the conditions, the outcome, the impact on personnel extraction, and recommended her for a decoration that she would receive in a ceremony she attended in a uniform she'd pressed herself that morning. She stood in the line with the other recipients and she thought about the wind data in her logbook and whether the prediction model held across different elevations. And she said, "Thank you, sir," when the moment came, and she meant it without needing it to mean more than it was. Afterward in the parking lot, Stein found her. He was on a different assignment now, something in Fort Campbell, and he'd come to the ceremony because Dutch had told him about it. He looked better than he'd looked in the Korengal. His beard had grown in enough to be intentional. He had the slightly different bearing that people get when they've been close to something terrible and come back from it, not harder exactly, but more settled, like the experience had pressed something loose into place. "I wanted to say something," he said. Mara waited. "In the compound? When we were pinned." He stopped, started again. Pena was pulling me toward the wall, and I remember thinking, this is it. This is actually it. And then the gun stopped, and I didn't know why for maybe 20 seconds. And then someone said it was the forward observer on the ridge, and I remember thinking, he stopped again. "You don't have to say it," Mara said. "I know. I want to." He looked at her. I remember thinking she called that third position 2 days before. She called it, and we should have adjusted more than we did, and she called the shot even when Hale said no, and now he shook his head slightly. "I just wanted you to know that I know that I got to go home because of that. My wife, my kids, they got me back because of that." Mara looked at him for a moment. She thought about something her grandfather had said once, about how the work you do when no one is watching is still the work, still counts, still matters in the ledger of things that are true, regardless of whether anyone else acknowledged them. He'd been talking about something entirely, about a field he'd maintained for 30 years that no one had ever praised him for, but she thought it applied here too. "You're welcome," she said. And then after a moment, "How's the beard?" Stein laughed. It was a sudden surprised laugh, the kind that comes out before you have time to perform it. "Getting there," he said. Mara nodded. She said goodbye and walked to her car and drove back to the base. And on the way she thought about the intelligence currency protocol, which was now 16 pages and had been sent up the chain to someone at USASOC who had forwarded it to someone else, and whether the 12-day threshold was actually the right number, or whether context-dependent tiering would be more effective in practice. She decided to write a supplemental addendum. She would start it that night.